Hi, everyone. Michael Cavacini here, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Thomas B. Sawyer. I met Tom a few years back at Thriller Fest in New York City, and I was very excited when I met him because I heard that he was the head writer of one of my favorite shows ever, Murder, She Wrote. And I said, I need to get to know Tom. And I had the opportunity to interview Tom back in 2013. And actually, within a few months of that interview, I interviewed Donald Bain, who was writing the Murder She Wrote books at the time. So I got a lot of Murder She Wrote going on in 2013. And Tom has a new book out now. It's called The Art of the Real Tom Sawyer, because before Tom got involved in writing for TV, he was a comic artist and a really skilled one. I mean, this book is really impressive. So we're going to talk about that during this interview. But thank you, Tom, for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure seeing you again, let's go.
Great. So, for those of you who, or for those who are tuning in who don't know your journey, how did you first get? Because I'm always talking to creative people because I see myself as a creative person. I think other creative people like to connect with people who are also creative because we kind of feed off each other. So how did you get involved at a young age, I guess, tapping into your creativity? Did you know what you wanted to do with it? Did you want to be a writer? Did you want to be an artist? Did you know where you wanted to go, or were you just kind of feeling it out as you went?
Well, it started very early. The minute I could hold a pencil, I started drawing figures. And by the time I was 7 or 8 or 9, comic strips, realistically drawn comic strips, had become an obsession with me that lasted for decades. And by the time I was, my parents very generously started sending me to art school in Chicago at a very, very early age, 7 or 8. And I eventually studied, or I did Saturday morning cartooning class at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. It was taught by a gag cartoonist, did panel gags for magazines. His name was Martin Garrity. And he was really a knowledgeable professional and a great asset to know. Anyway, and by the time I was 12, I had decided on my life path. I was going to become the next Milton Caniff. Now, for those of you, your viewers who don't know who Milton Caniff was, he was the first comic strip artist, syndicated comic strip artist, to do a realistically drawn strip with a more or less realistic dramatic storyline. Up until then, all the comic strips were comics. They were funny or attempted to be funny. And his first successful strip was called Terry and the Pirates. He later did a strip called Steve Canyon. And anyway, both of them were dramatic stories. And that's, by the time I was 12, I was fixated. That was what I was going to do. Now, these guys wrote their own stories. Most of them did. Some of them had writers that they worked with, the guys who did the comic strips. But, and in those days, you had to move to New York because that was where the business was. That was where the syndicates were, et cetera, et cetera. It's where the ad agencies were. And so at age 20, pissing my father off that I had dropped out of school, I moved to New York to get started and the way you got started in those days was in the comic books. Comic books cost 10 cents to buy at the newsstand. And I scoped out the business very quickly. I started out, drawing up samples. Western page, a detective page, whatever. But I had scoped out that the comic books didn't pay very well. It was $25 to $30 a page for penciling and inking a comic book page, which consisted usually of 6 panel drawings. And the advertising business paid from 10 to 100 times that amount for the same kind of work.
Wow.
So I decided, okay, I got to set myself up for that. It was just the beginning of the superheroes, and they were regarded by the comic book artists with some disdain. That we referred to them as underwear characters. And so I made an appointment to see Stan Lee at Marvel Comics, Timely Comics at that time. And I went and showed him my samples, and he said, yeah, it was a charming guy. And he said, yeah, Tom, I love your stuff. He said, I'll put you right to work. And I said, well, there's just one thing, Stan. I don't want to do your underwear characters. I want to do your romance books so I can learn how to draw pretty girls and handsome guys, which is what it took to get into advertising. And I said, that way I can get out of this business and into something that pays. And he laughed and put me right to work doing his romance comic books. And I did them for a couple of years, developed my technique, loosened my line, et cetera, and graduated to advertising illustration, which I did for another 10 or 12 years.
Wow. So you're working for Stan Lee. That's pretty incredible. So did he weigh in at all at that point, like on what you were creating, or was there someone else who was kind of supervising you as you created that?
No, he was the guy in charge.
And what was that like working with him?
Oh, it was I mean, we became social friends. We'd go out to dinner together and what have you. And as I said, the superheroes were just catching on at that time. They hadn't, gotten really, really big like they eventually did. But yeah, he was a witty, as I said, charming, handsome guy, and we became good friends.
That's great. So when you got into advertising, I mean, I assume you've probably seen Mad Men, and everyone always refers to Mad Men when they talk about advertising. Is there any truth to that show and what you experienced?
Which, Mad Men?
Yeah. Was the advertising world like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was. I loved the show. It was very much like that. The guys that they portrayed on Mad Men were mostly the account guys. They were the ones who dealt with the client, and they wore suits and ties and so on. When I began in that business, I too, acquired Brooks Brothers suits and vests and all of that. And within a few years, towards the end of the Mad Men era, in the 60s, the creative people who were always on another floor on Madison Avenue from the account people who dealt with the client, the creative people, that is the writers and the art directors and artists, what happened was they began to dress differently. And so I learned very quickly that the longer my hair got and the crappier my clothes got, the more money I made.
So you just let yourself go, right?
It was part of the act. But yeah, I love that Mad Men series for that reason, because I had been part of it.
Yeah. I actually started off working out at ad agencies and in a public relations capacity. But I remember seeing the head of creative department, he would wear shorts to work. He would wear a scarf even if it wasn't
Right.
cold. Just, people were very much characters, and
Yeah.
yeah, it was just a whole different vibe. But something I find really interesting when it comes to the advertising world is that there's two really big novelists who started off in advertising. You have James Patterson, who worked for Walter J. Thompson, and then Stuart Woods, who went on to becoming a best-selling thriller writer, who also started off in the advertising world. Why do you think people kind of from the advertising world writing that type of copy are known to become best-selling, thriller writers later on?
Well, I think, the advertising business attracted creative people. And, a lot of them stayed in that business, and a lot of them, like Patterson and Woods and myself. I got to a point that I think describes, maybe what happened with them. I got to a point one day, part of my mission, if you will, from the beginning had been to succeed, and I mean financially, because I was trying to prove to myself and to my father that I wasn't going to be a loser because I hadn't gotten an engineering degree, which was his passport to success. And one day I realized, by the time I was 29 years old, I had built a 10-room house on 2 acres of woods in Westport, Connecticut, was driving a Jaguar and having my clothes tailor-made. And one day I looked at all of that and I thought, okay, I've done it, and this is meaningless. I had also begun to explore filmmaking with 8mm home movies and so on, become fascinated by it, being a movie buff from the time I was a little kid. Mm-hmm. And I also was at a place where I was literally on Madison Avenue regarded as, quote unquote, the Norman Rockwell of line illustration. I had succeeded, and I knew it. And the challenge was gone from me. And I realized that holy cow, I'm never going to get any better as a graphic artist than I am at that point. And I've got another 30 years ahead of me. And I don't want to just be doing the same thing. I had gotten, by the way, to know and socialize with all of the comic strip artists who had been, many of them had been my heroes, or, close to it, Leonard Starr and Stan Drake and people like that. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered about them, or what I had observed about them, was they were all making what was in those days serious money, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. Al Cap, who did Lil Abner, was making $1 million. And they all were damaged goods. They all had some kind of problem: drinking, gambling, womanizing, whatever. And in my amateurish psychological appraisal, I blamed it on the fact that they had to do the same goddamn thing every day with no end. They never got to the end of a job and they could stop and start over. It was continuous. And it for me became, I no longer wanted to do a comic strip for that reason, because these guys were all prisoners in this velvet line trap that they had succeeded into in those days. And so I began to look around for some other challenge. And a challenge is what I need. I guess one of the things I've learned about myself is that once I know how to do something, I need to go on to something that's a challenge to me. My comfort zone is not being certain I can pull the next thing off. And so I thought, well, maybe filmmaking. Took a course at NYU, studied briefly directing because I decided early on that I needed to play God. I needed to be in control if I was going to make films. Studied briefly with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio. And decided to come to California. In those days, you had to be in California to be in the business. And so I started picking the brains of the filmmaker. I had been shooting commercials for the ad agencies and what have you, and also did a documentary. It's called Reunion that was about a New York actress going back to Beardstown, Illinois for her 15th high school reunion. It was a 15-minute film that won a bunch of awards, was featured at the New York Film Festival, Lincoln Center, and Rochester and Edinburgh festivals, and went on to national theatrical release. And I'm still very proud of it. If your viewers go to my website or to YouTube, they can find Reunion and watch it. Anyway, so in picking the brains of these filmmakers in New York who had worked in California, I learned a lot of things about, you have to lie about your age. You can't have any gray hair and things like that, which were very useful pieces of advice, it turned out. So I moved out here with a plan, and the plan was to make a low budget feature film, an R-rated comedy, what we used to refer to as a tits and ass comedy, about a hamburger. This was based on an old joke that I had heard about a hamburger waitress who sleeps her way to the top. So I rounded up a writer friend of mine in New York, and he was going to write the script. And we moved out here. I was still doing a little artwork just to, pay the bills for a couple of clients that I had that I worked with by mail. And lo and behold, my writer friend got a job early on Saturday Night Live, and he didn't have the time to write the script, so I wrote it myself. I knew what the basic joke was that I was basing it on, and rounded up low budget filmmakers around town, socialized with them, and made the film. It was originally called Gosh, and then the title got changed to Alice Goodbody. And I started screening it for distributors. I had to put up $105,000 of my own money to make the film, and which was pretty cheap in those days. And I began screening it for distributors, hopefully to get my money back. I've been there now in Hollywood and in Los Angeles area for a few years, and had done a lot of what we called networking. We did dinner parties in those days. Your wife would make dinner, and we'd invite 3 or 4 couples, and 1 or 2 of them might might be players in the business. And if you were at a party with them, you were accepted as one of the players. And so I started inviting a few of them to my screenings. And one of them, one couple, Lila Garrett and Mort Lockman. Lila Garrett was a multiple Emmy-winning writer and producer. And Mort Lockman had been Bob Hope's head writer for 28 years. And Lila was this ballsy lady. And she comes up to me after the screening, pokes me emphatically in the shoulder and says, "You should be writing for television." Mike, television had never even occurred to me. And being a writer had never occurred to me. And I said to Lila, well, she said, how would I get started doing that? And she shrugged as she was walking away. She says, I got a production deal. You got an idea, call me.
Wow.
And 2 weeks later, I called her. And my instincts were good. She didn't have time to talk. Typical Beverly Hills lady, I'm on my way out to a meeting. I can't talk for long. And I said, well, I'm just going to give you one line, Lila. And she said, quick, what is it? And I said, a gang comedy on a tacky used car lot in the valley. And she said, that's terrific. I'll produce it and you'll write it. And a week or 2 weeks later, my first paying job in Hollywood, I was writing a comedy pilot called Mother's Motor City for CBS. Now, you have to understand another unique thing about the business in those days, and I think probably it extends to today. The business was about 9 by 12. And within a few days, I didn't understand this was going on at the time, but within a few days, it was all over town that I was this new guy in town who was starting at that level, which was almost unheard of in those days, to start by writing a series pilot for one of the major networks. And all of the doors were open for me. It was it was a life changer.
That's incredible. So, knowing that, how did you figure out what made sense to do next?
Well, I got asked to write for various shows. I went on to come up with more series ideas. By the way, Mother's Motor City never got produced, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter. I had written the script for it. And that meant that I had access to the head of development at all of the three, in those days, major networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC. And I could call them or have my agent call them and make an appointment to come in and pitch a series idea or a movie idea. And in those days, today it's very different. You pitch to a committee. In those days, you pitch to one person who had the authority to say yes or no, and on the spot. I mean, I literally, more than once, several times, I would go in and pitch an idea for a series and walk out of the meeting with a commitment for a pilot script for $75,000 or $100,000. I mean, it blows my mind when I look back on it.
That's great. So then what was the first thing that you wrote for TV that, was produced, where you were able to see it on screen?
Oh, I don't even remember what it was, but I started out in comedy. Chico and the Man was one of them. All in the Family, I wrote an episode for. And I quickly decided that I didn't like the pressure of writing one-liners. And they used to count them. You had to have 3 jokes per page. And I felt that uncomfortable being pressured into doing that. So I switched to writing for the hour shows, the dramas, wrote for Wonder Woman, Quincy, shows like that, Mike Hammer, and as well as I created and sold 9 pilot ideas. None of them ever got produced. One of them got produced. It wasn't my idea. It was they had asked me to rewrite a script for a series that they wanted to greenlight, but they weren't happy with the script. And again, it was one of those reputation changers that where I got a call on a Friday afternoon from the guy at CBS in charge of development. He said, "Tom," he said, "would you mind if I sent you this script that we've got? We're not quite there on it, and we wonder if you'd take a look at it and see if you could maybe fix it." And I said, "Sure." So they messengered it out to me, and I called them that afternoon before the end of business, Friday afternoon, and said, "Yeah, it was the series was called Bring 'Em Back Alive." It was based on a character named Frank Buck, who was a hunter and quite in Asia, an American, and I said, "Yeah, I think I can fix it for you." And he said, "Well, go ahead." And they made a deal for me. And on Tuesday, I turned the script in, and the next day it got green lighted. And again, it's all over town, and almost instantly what I had done with it. And for the next few years, I was over and over, I was approached to do the same sort of thing, to fix a show that wasn't either going to get canceled or hadn't even gotten on the air yet. And I was never able, or rarely able, to save any of them because they were all fatally screwed up just from the concept. But it didn't matter. They kept throwing money at me to fix them.
Oh, yeah. So it's almost like you went from creating original content to trying to, I don't want to call it editing because it's more than that, but the editing process I like as a writer, because you can take something that is, pretty crappy, right? And you can take it from that level and be like, okay, we got it to a good place here. It's much better than it was when I first started with it.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of a rewarding feeling.
Oh, it was satisfying. There's no question about it. I mean, the tweaks and a lot of the stuff that happened, Mike, you didn't realize it at the time. A Murder, She Wrote. I got invited to write for this new series that was going to go on the air. It hadn't been broadcast, production hadn't even started. Mm-hmm. And I go to see this fellow, Peter Fisher, who had created this series, and it was called Murder, She Wrote. And I introduced, said hi and all of that. My agent had sent him a script that I had written, a pilot script for something. And so I said, before I said anything, the routine on a show like that or a new series was they'd send you into a room to look at the pilot. So they did. or he did. And I'm sitting there and I see that I am being invited to write for Angela Lansbury. I was totally blown away. I mean, the fifth-rate actors that I had been writing for, so many of them, to get a chance to write for one of the world's most famous, greatest actresses was just, blew my mind. So I came out of the room and said, "Wow, Peter, you have got such a hit on your hands." And he shrugged. He's been there before. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. He said, who knows? I said, "Well, let me ask you something, Peter." I said, "What kind of mysteries are these going to be?" And again, he shrugged. He said, "I'm sort of Agatha Christie puzzle mysteries." And I didn't often edit what I was about to say. And in this case, I certainly didn't. I said, "Peter, I have to tell you, when I was a kid, I read a few Agatha Christie's and a few puzzle mysteries or locked door mysteries." I said, "They bored the shit out of me, and I'm not going to write that for you." And he said, "What will you write?" And I said, "I'll write the Maltese Falcon." He said, "That'll be fine." And without realizing it, I had just contributed my biggest contribution to that show, because he understood the shorthand of what I was saying. The Maltese Falcon was and remains to this day the seminal modern detective story. It's a murder mystery with no clues and no suspects. It's a drama about a bunch of interesting characters in conflict with each other, and somebody gets murdered. And that became the format for Murder, She Wrote. And it ran for 12 seasons, 264 episodes.
Yeah, which is insane. I mean, and yeah, I can never really, and I still watch the episodes, and I own the whole box set and all that. But yeah, it was never predictable to me. I'm watching it, you're never really sure where it's going to go. And I also love the little preview at the beginning. That's something that no one does anymore, where they're like, "Tonight on Murder, She Wrote," and they show like kind of a highlight reel of what you're going to get, and then you go into the episode, which I thought that was an interesting choice. How did that come about, that whole idea of, hey, let's give them a little teaser?
Well, again, that I don't know how they decided to promote it, but it made sense, because basically it was to interest the audience in these characters who were going to be in this play that made up what the episode was about. It was a fascinating process, or at least fascinating to me.
Yeah. And so you get this opportunity to work with Angela Lansbury. What was that like? And what you're obviously, as time went on, your position within the writing team grew. So how did that evolve over time? What you started off doing for the show, and then where you eventually wound up as the head writer. And then what was it like kind of working with Angela? And you guys had some amazing guest stars as well.
Oh, well, she was a delight to work with. I mean, a total professional, and unlike a lot of actors with whom I'd worked, she was basically trouble-free. I mean, she understood what the series was about, and that she was this widowed widowed novelist who lived in this little town, Cabot Cove, and there happened to be a murder every week. And we this by creating these episodes where you had this new interesting cast of characters who were, after something, or trying to screw each other out of something. That was a fun way to write it. I mean, my first episode was called Broadway Malady, and it was about a Broadway show in rehearsal. That was the background for it. And it was fun to write, and new to me. I mean, I had done a few mysteries, Quincy and Mike Hammer and what have you, but they were different from this.
And so how much input would she have on the writing? Was she the type of actress would ad lib or no?
No, she didn't have any offer any input at all, other than it was interesting. The single frustrating aspect of it for me in writing for her on the show was that the character, as set up, had no emotional involvement with the drama that was going on in which the murder took place. She was an outsider in all of them. And given her amazing acting range, when I started writing for the show, I reviewed a number of her movies and was knocked out by her dramatic range. And we used very little of it on the show, very little of her acting capability. And I from time to time, I'd try to get her emotionally involved. I put an episode into work. I didn't write it, but I guided the script writer on it. It was called The Return of Preston Giles. And Preston Giles was in the pilot episode, was a publisher and a book publisher, and was the publisher of her first novel, Jessica Fletcher's first novel.
Mm-hmm.
And in the pilot, there was just a suggestion of an attraction between the two of them. And 7 years into it, it occurred to me that, okay, then it turned out that Preston Giles was the murderer, and he was sent to prison for life. Well, 7 years into the series, it occurred to me that he might have been eligible for parole. And wouldn't it be interesting if he came back into her life and there was an emotional connection that, built a little bit on that first episode, and then he dies in her arms.
Hmm.
And that's the way I had it written. And the way they shot it was he dies at her feet. She's standing there, no touching. And that was her choice.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember watching an episode recently. I don't know if it was that one or it was another one, but there was one where they suggested, again, some sort of like a romance that never kind of came to fruition, right? Like a guy who came back and to her life past, and you're like, oh, because with her, we still got Frank, right? Because she's a widow, and that in the books and the show, she's never becomes really romantically involved. And that's tricky, right? Because you can't really you're kind of restricted yet obviously it worked because it lasted for 12
Oh
seasons. So that,
yeah, yeah. I just wanted to use a little more of her range, to show her being emotionally involved with one of the characters. And it wasn't, believe me, a lot of worse things could have happened.
so who came up with these rules? Who said, like, here are the rules of Jessica Fletcher? We can't do this, we can't do that. Like, who
Well,
kind of
Peter
laid that
Fisher
out?
had come up with the idea for the series, conceived it in the first place. And by the way, a little piece of history that your viewers might enjoy. Angela wasn't the first choice for the role.
Oh, who was?
It was offered to Jean Stapleton, who had played Archie Bunker's wife in All in the Family,
Oh, wow.
and she turned it down.
I guess that wasn't the
Now
smart.
there's an additional funny story. So they approached Angela. Oh, they also, I heard recently that they had actually tried Doris Day, and she turned it down. But anyway, the Jean Stapleton part I'm more familiar with. Anyway, Angela, when she was offered the role, she said, I'd love to do it, but she said, I may have a problem because Andrew Lloyd Webber is writing a show for me. And he may be finished with it, and so on, and da-da-da-da. So she contacted Andrew Lloyd Webber, and he said, well, go ahead and do it. He was writing Sunset Boulevard
Mhm.
as a musical with Angela to play Norma Desmond. And he said, look, he said, the show probably won't last more than a year or two. And he said, I'm that far behind. I'm working on Cats, and I've got to finish it. So she took the role. And 2 or 3 years had gone by, and he had finally finished Cats. And on re-examining it, it had no memorable songs in it. So he took a song that he had already written for Angela for Sunset Boulevard, for her to sing as she comes down the grand staircase at the mansion, as Norma Desmond did in the movie. And the song was called Memories. And it had nothing to do with any of the characters in Cats, but it was the only song in the show that anybody remembers.
Yeah, I went to go see Cats the other year, and that's the only good part of Cats. Everything else, I'm like, it's kind of crap, right? Except for
There
that
you
song.
go. And the ironic thing was, it had been written for Angela. She was all right. When she took Murder, She Wrote, she said, he's already written a few songs for me.
Wow, that's wild. And so one thing I've noticed is, so like Scott Bakula, who's one of my favorite television actors, he's in Quantum Leap, NCIS New Orleans. He's been a guest star in a bunch of shows. He has a great singing talent, and they always, anytime he's in a show, at some point, inevitably, he winds up singing a song because he's good at that. So with Angela Lansbury, did you guys say, hey, we need to get her to sing at some point because, she's really good at that?
Oh, yeah. And we never did.
And was that because she didn't want to, or
No, it was just that was off the table. It was like it wasn't her character. It's like we'd have writers come in and pitch a story in which she was driving somewhere. Well, she didn't drive. That was the character. It was against the rules.
Right. There's like a book that
Jessica. Oh, exactly. Exactly.
That's amazing. So then how did you kind of graduate, I guess, if you want to call it, to head writer? I mean, how did you make it to that point?
Well, what happened was I had been on the show for the whole 12 years, off and on staff, or I'd get hired to go on another show or a spin-off, like I produced The Law and Harry McGraw, which was a Jerry Orbach series where he was a spin-off character from Murder, She Wrote. Anyway, at the end of 7 seasons, it was the end of Angela's contract. And she decided that she wanted to be co-executive producer with Peter Fisher, who had run the show and created it. And she insisted on that as part of her deal. Well, Peter Fisher's response to that was, I don't co-executive produce. And the network quickly observed that they needed her more than they needed Peter at this point.
Right.
So they dropped Peter from the series, made it Angela executive producer. She brought in her family, her brother, her husband was active as her manager, and she was at that point sort of fed up with Peter Fisher and with his whole regime, and that meant in their minds getting rid of even all the writers who had written the show up until then. There were 2 or 3 other guys like me who had written the bulk of the scripts. And so the first 2 episodes of season 8 involved car chases and guys in jumpsuits and ski masks carrying AR-15s. And it was so not the show that the audience was dying off, and the network went, bananas because they were killing the show. And so they asked me if I'd come in and fix it and bring it back to what it was. And I said, sure. And I did. And I stayed with it for the next 5 seasons until it got canceled.
Wow, that's great. So you, so when it came to, so you're talking about, I didn't realize about the whole Peter Fisher thing. So in the end, who owned or owns, I guess, the Murder, She Wrote brand? Because it went on to become
she and her family do.
Okay, so
that was part of her deal too, was ownership of the deal. And because they needed her, she was such a totally essential part of the show. They conceded to all of those things.
That's incredible. So she's this woman, an older woman, basically owning and producing a hit TV show. I mean, that's a pretty big deal for that time.
Yeah. I mean, she wasn't active as a producer at that point. It was more of a title than an active role, but it gave her final authority on everything.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that not many women and starring roles had that type of influence.
No, it's a rare thing.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, that show ran for 12 seasons, like you said, over 200 episodes, almost 300.
264 episodes. I wrote 24 of them.
Yeah, it's, I mean, a remarkable run. And then TV movies too after, right?
No, we didn't do TV movies of Murder, She Wrote.
I thought there were a few of the TV movies after the fact.
Well, if there were, maybe I'm not aware of it.
Okay. So then when it came to the show ending, was that a network decision, or did she have anything?
Well, that was a network decision, and it was it was based on some questionable logic.
Mhm.
We had, just to give you an idea of the success of the show and how the business has changed. On our next to last season, we had 25 million viewers a week. Today,
Wow.
if a show gets 2 million, it's a major hit. Because
Yeah.
there are so many, as we used to say, there are only so many sets of eyeballs to go around. And now there are hundreds of channels, whereas back then there were 3 or 4 prime channels and plus the local stations. And so we were able to get that big audience. Now, there was another show that went on the air opposite us, not opposite us, but on another evening. That, and I'm trying to remember the name of the series. I forgive me, but I've forgotten it. But they were able on this other series, which was on ABC, to charge more for the advertising than they did on Murder, She Wrote, because the audience was a younger demographic. They didn't have nearly 25 million viewers. It was more like 10 or 12, which was still a big hit. But they were able to charge like 50% more for the advertising. So the then guy who was running CBS, who I won't name here because I don't want things to come and bite me on the ass, he decided that for that reason he was going to kill the show. So in the 12th season, he started switching the show from one night to another night, and it cut our audience way back. So he had an excuse to cancel the series, but it was intentionally canceled. We still had, all these followers, and I made sure that the final episode of the 12th season made a comment about it. It was titled Death by Demographics. And it was about a radio show, but it was the same plot.
That's interesting. And so with that last episode, I mean, knowing that you went into that season, not realizing it was going to be the last, did you try to tie it up with a nice bow? I mean,
well, just that. I mean, and I'm not sure if it was that episode, but Jerry Orbach, the character played Harry McGraw, this private detective from Boston, as he comes out of Angela's house. The last line in the show is, "I guess that's all she wrote."
It's a great line.
Yep.
Yeah. It's funny that logic is flawed, not just because of the size of your audience, but when you look at a show like Boston Legal, for example, that apparently had the most affluent audience watching it because it was middle-aged people, and middle-aged people have more money than people in their 20s and 30s. So
but
really, that's who
they
you
don't
want
spend it on consumer goods as much as.
Right. So it seems like they weren't thinking straight. They should have been focused on the Murder She Wrote audience, because I bet you they had more net worth.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, what are you going to do? And so how did Angela deal with that? Were you privy to her thoughts on the cancellation, and was she frustrated with that?
No, I mean, we were all pretty pissed off about it, and but it was what it was, and we had 12 seasons, so it was hard to complain. It just it was so much part of CBS's policy that season that we just we couldn't do anything about it. So
Right. And there were some great characters in the show. You had, I just love the setting of Cabot Cove. Even the sound of that sounds warm and comforting. But, Seth Hazlitt and you had
yeah,
Mort Metzger.
he was a character that I created about two seasons, 3 seasons into it. I realized that while we stayed away from forensics and what have you. Sorry about my phone.
I don't know, no problem.
I'm going to pick it up. While we stayed away from forensics, in a town with a murder every week, we really needed a doctor, because
Right.
sometimes the person wouldn't be killed instantly, whatever. So I created the Seth Hazlitt character, and he worked very well.
Yeah. Well, I had no idea you created him. Fantastic. And the actor who you got to play him was just perfect.
Yeah, he was wonderful, and I'm embarrassed to say his name is slipping my mind.
And then, so speaking of actors, so you had two sheriffs. You had Amos Tupper, right, who was Tom Bosley, and then eventually you had Mort Metzger. So what happened to Amos? I was always curious. Where did Amos go?
Tom Bosley became a problem with the show. I wasn't producing it at the time, but I remember they had problems with him. He got, there a lot of shows, they allow the actors to ad-lib the lines.
Yes.
Well, in Murder, She Wrote, we buried clues in something somebody says in a scene early in the show. And if it turns out that the actor changed the script, it screwed us up and we had to reshoot. And that was one of the problems that Tom Bosley created. And so and there were other difficulties working with him, but I don't remember what they were. I just remember that there was talk about it, and so they finally got rid of him and brought in the other sheriff.
Yeah, he was great. And by the way, Seth Hazlitt was played by William Wyndham.
Yeah, he was wonderful. Great.
Yeah. And I do think it's, like I mentioned before, the novels. I think the fact that Murder, She Wrote ended when it ended, and that there are still new novels every year about the show, over 50, we're up to like almost 60. I mean, no other show has that. That's just remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they had made a deal with this publisher, and so they kept hiring writers to be Jessica Fletcher.
Yeah, it was. And so at Thriller Fest, when we originally met in 2013, that was your first time, I think, meeting Donald Bain, right? Who wrote all of the books for a very long period of time.
Right. He did for a long time, and then it got switched. John Land took over, and other people after that. And I think it still goes on.
Yeah, what was that like for you? Because both of you wrote for Jessica Fletcher, but just one for TV, one for books. What was that like finally meeting?
It was very typical of the publishing business. So it was not the most challenging thing in the world for Don Bain.
Yeah, but that's great to hear that that her family still owns the Murder, She Wrote brand, and that it continues to live on. And so, did you stay in touch with Angela over the years?
I did over the years. We occasionally see each other, but I'd speak to her on the phone a couple of times a year, and she was always just great, and sweet person, and I adored her, and saddened by her death, but hey, she got 96 years out of it. So, you know, that's not bad.
No, she definitely had a good run. And were you? And I'm not even sure if she was ill or what led to her passing. But had you spoken with her anytime recent leading up to that point?
It had been about a year or more since we had spoken. I don't know if one of our last conversations, I asked her if she'd give me a blurb for my memoir, and she
Yes,
said absolutely, and she did.
that's great. Yeah, and yeah, I remember when I met her, and I have you to thank for it. I got to meet her in Washington
Oh,
D.C. after and I got to meet her because they said, "Oh, I'm friends with Tom Sawyer," and I thought they wouldn't let me meet her, but they're like, "Oh no, you can." I'm like, "Get out of here, really?" So met her, told her, and I'd mentioned her that I'd seen her in New York and Gore Vidal's Best Man, and I thought she was terrific in that, and yeah, loved seeing her in Blythe Spirit. She signed her playbills, got a photo, and of course she said that you're a wonderful person, and that she loved working with you. So it was just great to have that opportunity. So thank you for that. But yeah, so what brought us together here today, like I said in the beginning of this conversation, is that you've got, it's a little blurred here because of my background, but you got a new book out. It's called The Art of the Real Tom Sawyer. So it's all about your life before getting into TV writing. So I mean, how did this book come about? And for those who are curious about what's inside, what can you tell them?
Well, I was approached a few years ago by an art professor in Canada, Hamilton, Ontario. He's a college professor. His name is Leif Peng. And he wanted to do a book about my artwork. He had followed my career and was familiar with, my starting out in the comic books and moving on to advertising. And to my surprise, I mean, I frankly, I just assumed that was all forgotten, and it turns out there are these people like Leif Peng and Anna Vlahovic, who designed the book, who really stay on top of these artists who were much more obscure than I. And if you go to Facebook, and there's stuff about them all the time. Life has a site on Facebook called Today's Inspiration, and every day people are posting stuff by comic book artists that I had either knew or had heard of, and comic strip artists and advertising artists like myself. And it's amazing that there's a following, and such a following of this stuff. And so I was terribly flattered to have anybody interested. And sure enough, Life did this absolutely beautiful book. It was over a year in the making, and finally got released a couple of months ago, and I'm very proud of it, and I think people should know about it.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful book, and I'm going to do a video about the book itself. So everyone who's watching this, make sure to check out that video where I'll be showing you what's inside.
I really appreciate it, Mike. It's it's fun trying to promote stuff like this. And I mean, I now write novels, and promotion is a big part of it. That's how we met. I would go to Thriller Fest to promote my books. And
Right. And speaking of that, so for everyone else, who's watching, I guess briefly let them know about that, the other books that you've written and these novels, if they want to get a taste of your writing in book form, what is it that you have available?
Well, I have a couple of thrillers, conspiracy thrillers, actually, one about the Kennedy assassination and one about 9/11. The 16th Man is the Kennedy book, and No Place to Run is the 9/11 thing. And then I switched, I wrote a memoir, The Adventures of the Real Tom Sawyer, and a companion book called 9 Badass Secrets for Putting Yourself in Luck's Way, which is how I describe my career. I put myself where luck could happen. And when it happened, when it came along, I lunged at it. And now I'm writing a series of humorous detective novels about a New York private eye named Barney Moon, who doesn't drive and is stranded in LA, which he regards as an alien planet. And I'm having fun with it. I'm writing the third of them at this point. And people can go to my website, thomasbsawyer.com, and read a little bit about each of these books. And they can look at my short films and things like that. So.
Great. Well, yeah, it's fantastic. I own all your books. Looking forward to the next. And this has really been a wonderful discussion and great catching up and learning more about your fascinating career, and that you've still got exciting stuff on the way.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you so much for your interview. It's very professional.
Oh, no problem. And everyone, make sure to check out Tom's website. And your website, the web address is?
It's thomasbsawyer.com.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. And we'll talk soon, I hope.